Which smartwatches do people love and which smartwatches do they hate? Well, normally on this channel we just deal with objective data, but today we're using your opinions to find out which smartwatches are your favorites and which are worst, and compare that to my objective scientific test results, and the findings are super interesting. We will look at this data in different ways. First of all, looking at differences between continents, men and women, and if people like their watch more for sports or for sleep tracking. We'll also check if your subjective feelings match my objective testing, so let's get to it. By the way, for those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Let's start with the most general overview possible. Specifically, I asked 2,411 of you, how likely would you be to recommend your smartwatch to friends or family on a scale of 1 to 10? And in this plot, I sorted all brands that at least 10 people owned, from average best on the left to average worst on the right. And there's quite a big difference between them. So we have the different brand names here along the horizontal axis, with interestingly OnePlus on top, closely followed by Apple and Coros. This surprised me a bit, especially OnePlus ending in the top spot, though it's important to note here that only relatively few people own a smartwatch from OnePlus. So it might just be by sampling size and chance that they ended up that high. Apple, of course, is not surprising to me, given the fact that only iPhone users will get an Apple Watch and they are more likely to also like other Apple products. Now, of course, even though there's that bias, it's still good to know that people are still happy with the Apple Watches. Coros in the third spot was also a bit of a surprise to me, since they ended up with a score about 0.5 higher than Garmin. This again might just be a sampling size issue, or maybe Coros generally gives people a better user experience. Coros is often seen as sort of a budget Garmin option, and the fact that people seem to be quite happy with it makes me more confident in recommending them in the future. Now, after these top three, we have quite a few brands with a score of around 8. These include Oura, Garmin, Polar, Huawei, Rincon, 8 Sleep, and Google, so the Google Pixel Watch most likely. And I would actually split these into two categories: health trackers versus sports trackers. Garmin and Polar are more sports trackers, whereas Rincon, Oura, and 8 Sleep are health trackers, with Google and Huawei being more multi-purpose, I would say. I've never tested Rincon, which is a health tracking ring, but it's interesting that they have the same recommendation score as Oura, which is the market leader in ring-based health tracking. So just from a subjective experience, the Rincon might be a valid alternative to the more expensive Oura ring. Now, the fact that Garmin and Polar right here are actually leading to a similar satisfaction score is interesting, given that Polar has recently done quite a bit worse in many reviewers' testing, also in mine. And as you guys know, I really love my 8 Sleep mattress, which has been the biggest positive effect on my sleep quality, especially in summer, since it can actively cool and heat the bed. I'm happy they got a generally pretty good satisfaction score, though one person was quite unhappy with it, which really pulled down the score. If you want to know more about the 8 Sleep mattress, check out my link up here. Or if you want to get the best deal possible and support the channel, it would be amazing if you buy it if you use my affiliate link below, which will give you the best deal possible. Next, let's take a look at the lower end devices right here. Specifically, I'm interested in the ones with a score of 7 or lower. Now, the Whoop strap right here barely misses that cutoff, but it's interesting to see that it has the audience divided, with some of them scoring it quite high, but others scoring it quite low. And the brands with even lower scores in this case are Honor, Ultrahuman, Samsung, Xiaomi, Fitbit, and Mobvoi. Especially Mobvoi appears to be just terrible. The first thing that really stands out to me here is that Samsung really scores quite a bit lower than both Google and Apple, which are arguably its main competitors. I expect that many, maybe even most people that buy a Samsung Galaxy Watch already own a Samsung phone, similar to how people that buy an Apple Watch own an Apple phone, but somehow that doesn't seem to translate back into user satisfaction with the Samsung Galaxy Watch. So this is interesting to me, and it does appear that if you own an Android phone, you're better off getting a Google Pixel Watch. And I must say, this is also largely true based on my testing. Now, this brand right here, Ultrahuman, produces smart rings similar to Oura and Rincon, but average customer satisfaction appears to be quite a bit lower. And finally, Xiaomi, Fitbit, and Mobvoi really have by far the lowest scores. I guess Xiaomi might score quite low since they produce budget smartbands, like the most budget smartbands out there, and the functionality and performance of these are rather limited. Still, for the price, they aren't always that terrible. For Fitbit, my guess would be that the low score is mostly due to production quality. Fitbits are known to break down a lot. I've had this happen a bunch of times, and if this happens after your warranty ends, you'll be left with a quite bad taste in your mouth. I've had Fitbits replaced 3 times within the warranty period. Even though the performance of Fitbit bands especially is not that bad in my testing, I really suspect that many people who filled out the form had their Fitbits break, and that's probably the reason it ended up with quite a low score. And to close off, we have Mobfoy, which with just a few votes scored really low. Now I'm unsure why it did so poorly. Maybe their typical design of having a dual screen, so one normal screen and one ultra low power OLED screen, is just not something people are happy with. But next, let's see if people in America, Europe or Asia gave very different scores to these devices. And you can see that in this overview right here. Along the horizontal axis we have the 6 continents for which I have data, and on the vertical axis we have the different brands. The more green the color, the higher the average score, and it's pretty clear that overall at least the general rankings are not vastly different between the different continents. However, we do see a few interesting differences. First of all, Coros right here and Polar right here get lower scores in Asia than in Europe and North America. Whereas Garmin, which is this row right here, gets a particularly low score in Africa. Apple, on the other hand, appears to be universally loved. I don't see any big differences between the different continents. And the biggest difference I can find is Rincon right here, which is a quite big difference between Europe and North America, with Europeans being quite a bit more happy with it. Still, overall, I would say that the general patterns in how happy people are with their devices is not that different between the different continents, except for a few exceptions. One thing I didn't notice before actually is that the Amazfit is not popular in South America at all, and quite a bit more popular in Asia, Europe and North America. But what about men and women? Do they have different opinions on the brands? Well, to some degree they do, and that's plotted right here, with the satisfaction score of women plotted in red and those of men plotted in blue, and the brands more liked by men on the top. And as you can see, women appear to like Coros, Fitbit, Samsung and Amazfit better, whereas men appear to have a slight preference for Whoop, Aura, Garmin and Apple. Again, the differences here aren't huge, but they are there nonetheless. But some of the most interesting data is still to come, so let's move on. As you'll see in a second, people actually bought different brands of smartwatches for very different reasons. Some smartwatches being more in line with people looking to improve their health, whereas others are bought more by people looking to track their sports. Specifically, I gave them the option of choosing between sports, sleep and general health. And all brands are surprisingly different in that regard, so let's have a look. But first, are you interested in tracking your glucose levels and finding out which foods that you take every day can cause big glucose spikes? I personally use the Levels app for that to find out which foods could spike my glucose and also energy levels. And I also use it for food tracking. If you want to get the best deal available, use my affiliate link below or up here. Or if you want to get personal running plans with live guidance during your runs, I use the Runner app, for which you can get a 2-week trial period with my link up here or down here. Now, I run this channel next to my full-time job as a scientist, so affiliate links are the way I keep this channel going. So if you're interested in either of these two, check them out. I really love them. But back to the testing. In this plot, you can see what percentage of people bought a smartwatch for a particular reason, and they could actually choose multiple options. So you can buy a smartwatch for all reasons simultaneously or just one. And the reasons they could choose from again were sports, sleep and general health. And let's first have a look at the brands most commonly bought with sports tracking in mind, which are Suunto, Coros and Polar right here, and also Garmin, though the difference is a bit smaller for Garmin. And this is not unexpected, of course, since these are really the known sports brands out there. But what about the brands that were mainly bought for sleep? Well, those are 8 Sleep right here, also Rincon, Ultrahuman, Aura, and those are the only ones that were mainly bought for sleep, it seems. Again, this makes sense. These are some rings and some sleep mattresses, so this is not that surprising. But what I find most interesting to see is that most people actually buy a smartwatch with general health in mind as well. So for most brands, the green bar is actually longest, meaning they bought it also with general health in mind. But how happy are people actually with their smartwatch or tracker for each brand if they bought it for different reasons? Say one person bought a Garmin watch for health tracking, where somebody else bought it for sports tracking. Do they have very different opinions on the quality of their Garmin watch? Well, let's have a look. So what I wanted to know is if the reason that people buy a smartwatch actually influences their opinion of that particular brand. Now on top are the brands that get a similar score even if they were bought for different reasons. And on the bottom are the ones that get a very different score if they were purchased for different reasons. And on top you can see that Apple is the most stable. Whether somebody bought an Apple Watch for sport, sleep or health, it doesn't really matter. It scores about equally well. Withings on the other hand shows the biggest difference, so it's here on the bottom, with devices bought for general health being judged quite favorably, but those bought for sports tracking not scoring that high. Withings as a company actually has body scales and blood pressure monitors and also smartwatches. And I expected the smartwatches actually score quite a bit lower than those general health devices. What was interesting to me is that both Suunto and Polar show quite big differences. These are both more general sports devices, but the way their differences express is quite different. So as expected, people are most happy with Suunto if they buy it for sports tracking, so this is not that surprising. But for Polar, this is actually the opposite. People are more happy with their Polar device if they bought it for sleep or general health tracking than if they bought it for sports tracking. And the same is actually also true for Coros to some degree, which is also more a sports tracker, where people are more happy with it for general health than for sports, though the difference is a bit smaller here. Overall, I wouldn't say there are huge differences, but it is still interesting to see that, for instance, Apple and Garmin are really stable, whereas Suunto and Polar show a bit bigger differences. So far, we've gotten a pretty good impression of what the top brands are that people are really happy with, and which brands do not lead to long-term satisfaction. However, all this lumps all possible models from each brand together. But what about the individual models? Which do people love and which do they hate? And here you can see the best 3 and the worst 3 devices per brand if I had at least 10 responses for them, and their average recommendation scores along the horizontal axis right here. Now, in the way I coded it, I did actually include both the brand and the final combined brand model name, which is why you have the double names right here, but I think it's still pretty clear which devices these are. So the devices people were most happy with are on top right here, and the ones they pretty much hated are on the bottom. In the top 10 right here, we have 3 Huawei models, 2 Apple models, 2 Garmin models, 2 Coros models, and 1 Amazfit device. Interestingly, the top performer is actually not a smartwatch, but Garmin's heart rate monitor, and people actually appear to be really happy with the HRM Pro Plus. Also, the next Garmin device people are really happy with is a somewhat older model, surprisingly, the Venue 2S, so apparently you don't need the most fancy newest Garmin device to be happy with it. Coros actually has both their latest running devices, the Pace 3 and Coros Pace Pro, in the top 10, which makes sense as these are well-performing, more budget Garmin alternatives. And of course, Apple has their 2 latest models in the top 10, the Series 10 and Ultra 2. Interestingly to me, the Amazfit T-Rex 3 right here, which is an Amazfit device that did quite well in my testing, is also up here. This is the first Amazfit device I could actually recommend. This is more of an outdoorsy Amazfit device, good for trail running or hiking, for instance. And finally, Huawei has a few older devices like the Huawei Watch GT Runner and the Huawei Watch GT 4 in the top 10 as well, and also the latest Huawei band, the Huawei Band 10. The Huawei Watch GT Runner and GT4 both did really well in my testing, and for a budget option, the Band 10 is actually also not that bad. If you're interested, my latest review was just released. But what about the bottom 10? Well, the bottom is really dominated by Fitbit, including the Sense, Sense 2, Versa 3 and Versa 4. It appears that people are really not happy with these Fitbit smartwatches. Interestingly, the different style of Fitbit, so the smart bands, which are the Fitbit Charge 6 and Inspire 3 right here, actually appear to do quite a lot better in people's opinion. So these more smart band style Fitbits appear to be much more popular than the smartwatch style ones. Some of the poorest performers also include many Samsung devices, like the Galaxy Watch 5, the Watch 4 and the Watch 4 Classic. It really seems that Samsung should step up their game. People just aren't that happy with their devices. Even the best performing Samsung watches are still mediocre compared to the competition. So we have the Samsung Galaxy Watch 7 right here, the Galaxy Watch 6 Classic and the Galaxy Watch Ultra. Finally, some older Garmin devices like the Fenix 6S Pro and the Garmin Venue also get quite low scores. But let's dive even a bit deeper into the individual models and let's take a look at the top and worst performing devices per brand. Now, I won't do all brands, but just the 6 I found most interesting. I'll try to post all plots somewhere down here in the link below so you can download the PDFs as well if you're interested in a brand that I didn't show. But first, if you're finding these videos interesting, it really helps me get access to new devices sooner and helps me reach more people if you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Pressing those 2 buttons really makes a huge difference, and commenting also helps. I would really appreciate it. And to anyone who's already subscribed, thank you so much. Garmin, for instance, has never sent me a watch before release, which is why my reviews are always 2-3 weeks later than those of other reviewers. Getting more subscribers is one way to convince them to also include me in the testing. But back to the video. So these are the Apple Watches at least 5 people owned, and the general pattern seems to be that the newer devices are scoring better. So the top 3 are the Series 10, Ultra 2 and Series 9. The Series 8 is also quite high. The Series 7 is somewhere in the middle. Interestingly, the SE Gen 2 is also doing quite well. This is not such an old Apple Watch, but the Apple Watch Series 4 also did quite well for some reason. This might just be a fluke, I have no idea, or people who bought it at the time just kept it and are still happy with it. the Series 3, 5, the older SE, the SE Gen 1. So people marked it either as SE Gen 1 or Apple Watch SE. I guess these should be combined. And also the older Apple Watch Ultra are doing worse than the newer devices. But overall, as a general pattern, people are quite happy with their Apple devices. Now, Garmin actually has a lot of different models, so there's also quite a variety in how people score them. The things people were most happy with is the Fenix 7X Pro, the HRM Pro Plus, the Venue 2S and Duro 3, the Forerunner 265F, the Forerunner 955 and the Fenix 7 Pro and Venue 3. All these devices on the top here got quite a high score, and these appear to be somewhat more premium Garmin devices, so not the cheapest ones out there, except for maybe the HRM Pro Plus, which is a chest strap, but also not the cheapest chest strap out there. And then if you look at the bottom, these are generally older or cheaper Garmin devices. So we have the Fenix 5, the Venue, the Fenix 6S Pro, the Forerunner 235. Here there's also the 955 Solar, not that old, the 245 Music, Venue 2. So generally somewhat older devices, I would say. So this is at least somewhat similar to what we saw for Apple. People just are less happy with older devices. I don't know if this is a real difference in performance or just a feeling like you don't have the latest device. And for Fitbit, we already previously saw the big difference in the high scores and the low scores. So the ones that score low are all the smartwatch style Fitbits. So the Sense 2, Versa 3 and Versa 4, whereas all smart band style Fitbits score higher than these smartwatch style ones. And the best ones in these cases being the Inspire 3 and Charge 6, both of them actually did quite well in my testing, especially the Charge 6. For Samsung right here, also my feeling is that the newer devices are doing a bit better than the older devices. Especially the Samsung Galaxy Watch 5 and Watch Active 2 are doing really poorly, but also the Samsung Galaxy Watch 4 isn't that popular. On the other hand, the Watch 7, Watch 6 Classic and Watch Ultra are doing okay, at least relative to all the other Samsung devices. For Huawei, there's also quite a big spread in devices. Mostly older devices are doing worse, so the pattern is maybe not that clear. The Huawei Watch D2, which is a blood pressure monitor watch, actually does really well. People seem to be really satisfied with it. I'm still testing it. Hopefully I can still make a video about it, but it's interesting to see people are really happy with it. It's also a relatively small target audience here, so people that really want it probably bought it, and that might lead to general satisfaction. And as we saw before as well, the GT Runner and Huawei Band 10 are also doing quite well. And when I first saw these Polar results, what I found most interesting is the top 4 right here has 3 heart rate monitors in them. So out of the top 4, 3 are not smartwatches, but just dedicated heart rate monitors. So we have the Polar H10 chest strap, the Polar H9 chest strap and the Polar Verity Sense. Only the Polar Pacer Pro right here made it into the top 50% of Polar devices. And the bottom 50% are all the smartwatches. So people seem to like the heart rate monitors of Polar a bit more than their smartwatches. Even within the brand, so between models, there appears to be quite a big difference as to how satisfied people are with their health or sports tracker. And depending on the brand, the patterns were quite different. For Fitbit, for instance, the bands were more popular than the watches, whereas for Apple, the age of the device had quite some influence. Now, the final thing I wanted to check is if your subjective opinion actually matches my objective performance testing of these devices. Now, I only have the data saved in a very convenient way for the heart rate tracking performance, so that's what we're going to focus on. Let's first compare the heart rate tracking performance during outdoor cycling as measured by the correlation with the chest strap with the average score for each smartwatch for the sports trackers. Along the horizontal axis is that heart rate tracking performance, and on the vertical axis is that average user satisfaction score per device. And though the agreement here is far from perfect, there's definitely some correlation between how well it performed in my testing and how happy you guys are with the different devices. On average, the devices that scored higher in my heart rate testing for outdoor cycling also do better in your subjective opinions. We can see, for instance, that Apple Watches, some Huawei devices really get high scores for both my testing and also the user satisfaction score. And the same goes to some degree for instance, the Pixel Watch 3 and the Fitbit Charge 6, though there the difference is a bit bigger. And there are a few devices that defy these numbers. The one that first of all stands out to me is the Oura Ring. So the Oura Ring is a really poor heart rate tracker, so it's very far to the left along the horizontal axis. But people are still happy with it. And this makes sense to some degree because the Oura Ring isn't really a sports tracker, it's really a general health and sleep tracker. And the sports functionality was added later, and honestly heart rate tracking on the finger just is terrible in any of my testing. So heart rate tracking during sports is not really a core competency of Oura and also not really a reason why people buy one. And two other outliers right here are the Fitbit Versa 4 and Sense 2, which did do really poorly in my testing in terms of heart rate tracking performance, but they defy the general pattern by being hated even more than you would expect. And again, this is probably a combination of poor performance and the things just breaking down all the time. Finally, the last brand I wanted to highlight is Garmin, which tends to end up more above this line right here, meaning that people are happier with it than my performance would suggest. And this makes some sense, as the general ecosystem of Garmin, the way they integrate with different devices, and the GPS tracking performance is just great. So heart rate tracking performance is just one of the factors, and probably not the single main reason people buy Garmin devices. They buy them for their battery life, the GPS tracking performance, the general ecosystem, and maybe also the heart rate tracking. But then it also seems people combine it with the HRM Pro Plus, but then people still seem to buy external Garmin heart rate monitors. So again, people are happier with Garmin than my testing would suggest. But this is for outdoor cycling. What about indoor cycling? Well, those results are displayed right here, and here the trend is much less clear. But this is also because almost all devices do quite well for heart rate tracking during indoor cycling. It's just much easier to track my heart rate for indoor cycling, so it makes sense that there's just less difference between devices and you cannot see such a clear trend. Finally, for weightlifting, we get more or less the same result as we saw for outdoor cycling, a much more striking trend with a quite strong correlation between the heart rate tracking performance and the average user score. Still, as regular viewers will know, I don't recommend using a smartwatch for heart rate tracking during weightlifting. If you want to track your heart rate during weightlifting, just get yourself an ECG chest strap. And apparently the HRM Pro Plus is really popular from Garmin. Or was it actually the HRM Pro? Well, I think both are great. I found this quite surprising. Honestly, I don't know about you. I didn't expect people would notice if their watch was performing poorly in terms of heart rate tracking. Now, I have a few explanations for why my objective testing and your experience actually correlates. Now, first of all, if a watch is performing really poorly, some of you would definitely notice, since many of you will know what your heart rate ranges are in different scenarios. Second, there might be some association between how much a company invests in their heart rate sensor and how much they invest in the overall user experience. So user experience might actually correlate with heart rate tracking performance. Richer companies or companies that really care about their product might just make sure that both quality and user experience are on par. And third, my polling here was not of random people. These were all subscribers of my YouTube channel, which you likely also are. And they likely have seen at least some of my videos and most likely also the video on the particular smartwatch they own. So they might have actually seen if their device did well in my testing, and that could have influenced their opinion. And that's actually a general limitation of this video. My polling doesn't necessarily reflect the general population, but just you, my subscribers, and only those actually that took the time to fill out the form. Still, I think the results are super interesting, and I think it is important to make sure that on the one hand the device performs well, but in addition people are happy with the average overall user experience. By the way, I actually used the question, how likely would you be to recommend your smartwatch to friends or family on a scale of 1 to 10, as sort of a proxy for how happy people are with their device. I could have phrased it differently, of course, I'm not a polling expert, but this seemed like a good way to make it less about the individual and more about general recommendations. Now, I'm gonna leave the questionnaire live, so you can still fill it out in case you want to share your opinion for a future video, and you can find it linked up here or down here. Now, if you want to get sneak previews on results, consider becoming a YouTube member. If you want to track your glucose, I'd recommend the Levels app. For running, the Runner app. Or if you decide to get an Apple Watch, a Garmin device, a Whoop strap, an Oura Ring, an HD Pod 4, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, you want to support the channel and save the maximum amount of money, there are different affiliate links in the description below. Now, give no trust this whole video on all these devices. I think you will like this video on the best sleep stage trackers or this video on the best heart rate trackers.